You know that feeling, right? You pick up your phone, maybe just to check one quick thing, and then bam, 15 minutes are just gone.
Yeah, vanished.
You've been scrolling, tapping away, but you can hardly remember a single thing you actually saw. It's like your brain just, I don't know, checked out and your thumb took over.
That's a really common feeling, that sort of mindless consumption. It's everywhere.
Exactly. That pull of the endless stream.
So that's the kind of thing we're digging into today on the Deep Dive. We take these feelings, these habits, and we really try to unpack them by looking at some interesting source material.
Getting beneath the surface.
Right. And today we're looking at a book by Emil Isaacson. It's called Köttrobotar Utkast 2.pdf.
Which translates from Swedish as Meat Robots Draft 2. That's quite a title.
It really is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Definitely makes you stop and think. We're going to focus mainly on the very first chapter, which is titled En apa som inte vet när den ska sluta.
An ape who doesn't know when to stop. Okay. Yeah. That title alone kind of sets the stage, I think. It points straight at that challenge. Knowing when enough is actually enough, especially now with, well, everything.
Endless options, endless input.
Precisely. So our mission for this deep dive is to really get to grips with the main ideas in this opening chapter. What's Isaacson saying about why we consume things the way we do, particularly in the digital world? And maybe more importantly, what makes us sometimes act like that ape who just can't stop.
Trying to understand the fundamental forces, the drivers behind these behaviors.
Exactly. Now, before we dive headfirst into Chapter 1, maybe let's just quickly get the bigger picture of the whole book. Isaacson's main argument in Köttrobotar, it seems, is that this modern digital consumer society we're in, well, it can actually be pretty bad for our well-being.
Right. He suggests it turns us into these meat machines.
Yeah, that term again. Constantly pushed to consume all sorts of stuff, and digital things like games, social media, but also physical products, services, you name it.
It paints a pretty critical picture of, the individual caught in that cycle.
It does. And just to give you a quick roadmap of where he goes after this first chapter, the later chapters have titles like The Elite Who Lead the Sheep, the Real Winners.
Okay.
Then everyone is on stage, no one is in the audience. Which sounds intriguing, and one I think we can all relate to. You've eaten too much information, and now you have a stomach ache.
Yeah, information overload is definitely a thing.
Totally. He also talks about planned obsolescence, that wear and tear yourself against the wall idea, and then maybe offering a bit of hope. The last chapter is, you don't have to participate in the madness.
So it's quite a wide-ranging critique looking at the pressures and the downsides of modern consumer life.
Definitely. But like we said, today is all about Chapter 1, an ape who doesn't know when to stop. And right off the bat, Isaacson hits us with this really foundational idea. He says, look, we've lived in settled societies for, what, maybe 10,000 years?
Roughly, yeah. Since the agricultural revolution took hold.
But from an evolutionary standpoint, that's just a blip, a tiny fraction of our history. He argues that we are still, fundamentally, running on the same basic operating system as our nomadic ancestors from, 200,000 years ago.
And that's such a crucial point, that huge evolutionary timescale.
Yeah.
It's baked certain instincts, certain responses deep into us. Understanding that ancient wiring is, well, it's key to figuring out why we do things now.
He really hammers that home. Says you can't understand modern behavior without grasping that deep past. And he makes a really important clarification early on. Consumption itself isn't necessarily bad.
No, of course not. It's essential.
Right. He says it's basically the engine of our capitalist society. And we consume things because, well, often it feels good. It brings enjoyment, value. The problem, as he frames it, starts when that consumption slides into, well, addiction or just pure compulsion.
That's the critical line, isn't it? Between consumption as a normal, even positive part of life, getting food, pleasure, information, and consumption that just spins out of control and starts causing harm.
Finding that balance.
Which, as Isaacson argues, is so tricky, precisely because we're wired from way back to react to certain things in ways that helped us survive in a totally different world.
Okay, so let's dig into that. He gives some examples to make this distinction clear: healthy versus unhealthy consumption.
Okay.
For healthy consumption, he uses the example of engaging with culture. So watching a movie, listening to music.
Things we choose to do.
Exactly. He argues this is balanced because we are in control. We get something valuable out of it, maybe inspiration, maybe an emotional connection, maybe just plain enjoyment, but it doesn't usually lead to negative stuff or that feeling of being forced to keep going. We pick what, when, how much.
That makes sense. It's deliberate. It's self-directed. You choose an album. You listen. You decide when it's over. There's a clear start and finish based on your own choice.
Right. Then, on the flip side, the unhealthy example, and this is the one I think hits home for a lot of us, is that habit of compulsively checking social media. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. Scrolling even when you kind of know there's probably nothing new or important there.
That feeling of just refreshing again and again.
Yeah, and he asks some pretty pointed questions like, are you actually enjoying that endless scroll? Are you really entertained? Are you learning anything useful? And maybe the killer question, can you even remember most of what you just saw 5 minutes later?
Yeah, those can be uncomfortable questions to answer, honestly, can't they? That automatic scrolling with zero real focus or memory of it afterward.
Exactly. And Isaacson basically says, look, often the answer to those questions is just no. He argues this kind of scrolling becomes a deep-seated compulsion. Our older, more primitive brain part is hunting for a reward, a notification, some little dopamine hit, but it often doesn't really satisfy us.
It's a search that doesn't quite land.
Right. And so afterwards, we're often left feeling meh, uneasy, maybe even a bit let down. So in that case, the consumption itself ends up having a negative effect on how we feel.
So it's consumption-driven less by genuine interest or pleasure,
Right.
and more by this sort of basic, almost instinctual urge that isn't really getting fulfilled. And it's interesting, he flags that not all social media use is bad. He hints he'll get into that nuance later.
He does. And then he draws a parallel with things like alcohol and drugs. He says, hey, even these aren't automatically unhealthy
Right.
because they can offer some kind of value, maybe pleasure, maybe a bit of creative inspiration, maybe they help with mental balance sometimes, or just socializing. The line gets crossed, he says, when the use becomes compulsive or when it just stops giving the person any real benefit or enjoyment.
So again, it comes back to that balance and the individual's actual relationship with the thing. Is it adding something or taking away?
Exactly. Now, Isaacson then dives into some specific primal drives these things hardwired into us for survival back in our hunter-gatherer days and how they cause friction in our modern world of, overload. Let's start with food.
Okay, food. Makes sense.
He explains how, for our ancestors, finding food was unpredictable, right? So if you stumbled upon a big source of calories berries, a successful hunt, it was a massive evolutionary advantage to just eat as much as you possibly could right then and there.
Store up that energy. Makes perfect sense for survival when the next meal was uncertain.
Totally. But fast forward to today. After farming, after industrial food production, food, especially high-calorie, sugary, fatty food, is everywhere. It's cheap, it's easy to get, and that ancient wiring telling us to gorge. Now it often leads straight to problems like obesity because the brakes aren't environmental anymore. The responsibility to stop eating falls almost entirely on us, the individual.
That's such a powerful disconnect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our bodies are still basically running Stone Age software in a world of 247 supermarkets and fast food.
Yeah.
That creates this constant internal battle for self-control. Our biology screams, eat it all, but our modern reality requires restraint.
And he mentions the classic marshmallow experiment from the early 70s to illustrate this. You probably remember it. Little kids, one marshmallow now, or wait and get two later.
Oh yeah, Walter Mischel's study.
A classic. Right. And the follow-up studies found this fascinating link. The kids who really struggled to wait, who couldn't delay that gratification, were statistically more likely to face issues like obesity and even substance abuse later in life.
It really starkly shows that tension between wanting something now versus our ability to think long-term and control impulses, that capacity to resist immediate pleasure.
Right.
It's a huge factor in long-term well-being, highlighting that constant fight between primal urges and self-regulation.
Absolutely. And Isaacson points out, quite rightly, that entire industries, fast food, snacks, candy, are basically built on expertly triggering these innate cravings for calorie-dense rewards. He stresses that while these temptations are everywhere, managing those powerful instincts ultimately comes down to us.
It's that constant dance between our biology and the choices we make in the environment we've created.
Then he shifts gears into another, maybe more sensitive area, pornography. He looks at potential evolutionary roots first. He proposes this idea that maybe in some polygamous nomadic groups, mating rituals were perhaps initiated by the matriarchs, maybe to time pregnancies beneficially. And during those times, the men would have been biologically driven to mate with as many partners as possible. Basic genetic survival strategy.
Maximizing reproductive success. It's a standard evolutionary principle, the drive to pass on genes.
Right. And this, he suggests, could have created a reinforcement loop. The more potential partners around, the stronger the male drive became. Men who got into mating mode quickly had an advantage.
It's a theory rooted in maximizing the chances of offspring.
Okay, now contrast that picture, maybe seasonal, maybe socially structured mating opportunities, with modern internet porn. Available 24/7, infinite variety, just clicks away.
A completely different reality.
Totally. Isaacson argues that this constant, limitless availability takes that old reinforcement mechanism and just cranks it up to 11. The sheer number of perceived willing partners online amplifies that drive massively.
Our brains just weren't built for that kind of input. It's like an evolutionary mismatch on steroids, this hyperabundance. We have no natural off switch developed for it. The internet presents a level of sexual stimulus that's completely unprecedented in human history.
He makes this striking point. Someone today could engage with more partners online in maybe 10 minutes than an ancestor might have encountered in their whole life. And our brain chemistry just isn't adapted for that relentless pursuit of a supply that literally never ends. He even points to stats, like from Pornhub, showing that consistently, way more users are male than female.
And he links that back to the idea that female mating interests might be more tied to biological cycles historically, whereas males evolved perhaps to be more reactive to perceived availability. So constant online availability could fuel compulsive use patterns, particularly in men.
And he tackles a potential question here. If the drive is so strong, why aren't men just acting out all the time in the real world?
Right. Good question.
He puts it down to the incredibly powerful force of social norms, laws, cultural rules. These act as huge constraints in most societies. But, he notes, those constraints are often totally absent when someone is consuming porn alone, online. There's no social hierarchy, no competition, no real-world consequences in that private space.
That's a critical difference. The social structures that regulate behavior in public just aren't there in the same way online, in private.
Okay, so next up, Isaacson brings in this concept of intermittent reinforcement.
Skinner's rats.
Exactly. He draws this really interesting line connecting social media use and gambling based on this principle. He reminds us about B.F. Skinner's experiments back in the day with lab mice and a lever. Sometimes pressing it gave a food pellet, sometimes nothing.
Yep, and the big takeaway was that when the reward was unpredictable, random, the mice went kind of nuts for the lever, pressing it obsessively, compulsively, because they never knew when the next reward might drop.
Precisely. And Isaacson says, look, that same mechanism is incredibly powerful for us humans, too. It's the engine behind gambling lotteries, slot machines, sports betting. That uncertainty of the reward, the chance of getting something, even if it's small or unlikely, keeps us hooked.
The unpredictability is the key. It wires the brain to keep seeking, keep trying.
And he argues that's exactly what happens with social media. You refresh your feed. Maybe there's a great post, maybe a notification, maybe nothing interesting at all. It's unpredictable. And that occasional hit, that random reward, keeps us scrolling, keeps us checking, even if logically we know it's often not that rewarding.
That random dopamine hit trains the behavior. The possibility, however slim, keeps us coming back for more.
Now, building on this, Isaacson takes a slightly different look at the whole idea of addiction, and he uses this really great analogy, scratching a mosquito bite.
Okay, I'm listening.
You know you shouldn't, right? You get that instant relief, that tiny bit of pleasure, but you also know it's probably going to make it itch more later, maybe even get infected. But lots of us still scratch it anyway.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah. So he asks, would you normally call that compulsive scratching a mental illness? Probably not, he suggests. It's seen more as a natural, if unhelpful, response, seeking immediate relief.
That's a really clever analogy. It questions that strict medical disease model of addiction by comparing it to a very common, understandable behavior driven by immediate sensation, even with known negative outcomes.
He argues that lots of behaviors, sex, gambling, shopping, even drug use, they exist on a spectrum. They can range from being totally normal, pleasure-seeking activities, all the way to being genuinely harmful compulsions. And he raises a concern about just slapping the label sick or diseased on someone.
What's the concern?
He suggests it might actually take away their sense of personal responsibility, their agency. It could make people feel powerless, overly reliant on maybe pharmaceutical fixes, and shift the control from the individual to the disease.
So it's a call for a more nuanced view, One that acknowledges the behavior patterns but maybe keeps the focus on the individual's capacity to understand and change rather than just defining them by a condition.
Exactly. It emphasizes choice and context alongside the compulsive element. Okay, then he moves into tribalism and conflict.
Right. Group dynamics.
He explains that for our ancestors, survival absolutely depended on protecting their own group from outside threats, predators, other potentially hostile human groups. This naturally led to prioritizing internal group harmony and being wary of sometimes needing to fight outsiders.
In-group cohesion, out-group suspicion. Basic survival logic for millennia.
And he mentions Dunbar's number here, that idea that we have a sort of cognitive limit, maybe around 150 people, for maintaining really close, stable social relationships.
Yeah, Robin Dunbar's idea, it suggests our brains are kind of wired for small group living, which makes sense given our evolutionary past.
He also talks about how kids' play in those ancient tribes probably served as crucial training. Maybe girls' play often focused more on social skills, cooperation, resolving conflict within the groupthink cooperative games, storytelling. While boys' play might have more often simulated defense, competition, fighting off threats, think tag, mock battles.
Interesting how play could have directly prepared them for the different roles needed for the group's survival and smooth functioning, practicing essential life skills.
And he links this to transition rituals, rites of passage during adolescence that marked the shift from play to applying those skills for real for the tribe's benefit. He sees echoes of these ancient traditions in things like modern graduations or confirmations.
Markers of moving into adult roles and responsibilities.
He even connects organized sports and competitions in our civilized world back to this. He sees them as a way we continue to express those older competitive, even tribal instincts, but in a controlled, socially acceptable way.
A structured outlet for those ingrained drives. Keeps the competition contained mostly.
He also briefly touches on this seemingly human fascination with risk, a lust for risk, he calls it. He points to things like those ancient Mesoamerican ball games where losers might literally die, or Roman gladiators.
High stakes.
Yeah, activities that seem almost counter-survival, yet humans are drawn to them, pushing limits, seeking thrills. He suggests there might be some biological basis for this attraction to danger, often involving people on the edges of society participating. And then he connects it all back to video games.
Ah, the modern arena.
Right. He argues that video games tap directly into that subconscious desire for risk, for challenge, for competition, but crucially, without the real danger. You get the thrill, the sense of accomplishment, maybe even simulated combat, but without the actual physical consequences.
That combination, the excitement of risk without the actual cost, can be incredibly potent.
And he says this can offer a kind of double satisfaction, which is why it can become so compelling, potentially leading to dependency or a feeling of detachment from the complexities of real life. Gaming can offer achievements that feel out of reach otherwise.
A controllable world where you can be heroic or successful in ways that feel difficult outside the game.
And interestingly, he notes that even in gaming, you often see gender preferences that echo those old play patterns. Women perhaps drawn more to relationship building, social simulation, role-playing games.
While men might gravitate more towards the conflict-driven, competitive, action-heavy titles.
Yeah, it's a fascinating parallel, suggesting these deep-seated tendencies keep showing up, even in our newest forms of entertainment.
So these ancient behavioral patterns are remarkably persistent, just finding new outlets.
And that's really the core message he wraps up Chapter 1 with. Despite all our amazing technology, all our societal changes, our fundamental behaviors, our core drives are still deeply, profoundly shaped by our distant ancestral past.
They're just expressing themselves in new ways, using new tools in a completely new environment.
So this first chapter really lays down that evolutionary foundation. It sets the scene for the rest of the book, which will presumably explore how these ancient drives get tangled up with, and maybe even exploited by, our modern digital consumer world.
A crucial starting point.
Yeah.
Understanding the ancient ape within us.
Exactly. So just to kind of pull the main threads together from this chapter, we've got this ancient programming running on modern hardware, basically. That makes finding balance in consumption really, really hard.
Mm-hmm. The mismatch is key.
Our primal instincts for food, for sex, for belonging, for managing threats, they were vital for survival and scarcity, but now they're constantly being pinged in a world of overwhelming abundance and stimulation.
Leading to overload, and dysregulation.
Then there are these powerful psychological tricks, like intermittent reinforcement that things like social media and gambling tap into, keeping us hooked.
Exploiting our brain's reward system.
And even our social dynamics, our tribal feelings, our attraction to risk and competition, they all have roots stretching way, way back.
Understanding these origins is really the first step, isn't it?
Yeah.
Gaining some insight into why we feel and act the way we do.
And that really brings it back to you listening right now. As we've been talking through this, did any of it ring true for you? Did you recognize some of those patterns in your own life?
Yeah, can you see echoes of these primal drives in how you use your phone or what you eat or the games you play?
Have you felt that pull, that almost magnetic urge to just check your feed one more time? Or that tendency to maybe eat past fullness sometimes?
Maybe take a second to think about those moments of mindless scrolling or those little dopamine hits from notifications. Where do you see these ancient patterns showing up in your day-to-day?
So here's something to maybe mull over after this. If we accept Isaksen's premise that our brains are still largely wired like our nomadic ancestors, how can you personally navigate this crazy, hyper-stimulating modern world more consciously? How do you avoid becoming that ape who just doesn't know when to stop?
Yeah, if so much of our modern behavior is rooted in these ancient survival hacks, how much control do we really have over our choices in this digital landscape? Or are we often just running old code on new platforms, maybe without even realizing it? Where might these primal forces be shaping your choices today?